mom, Karen, and his sister, Jessie, who have joined us. So thank you very much. So Alec is going to be senior in high school this year. He's a very accomplished young birder. He monitors his own nest boxes and reports the findings, the observations through Nest Watch. He leads bird walks for kids, and he does presentations like this with the hope of getting others inspired to learn about to protect birds. In 2014, Alec was invited to participate in Cornell Lab's Young Birders event. He was one of 16 young ornithologists chosen worldwide to participate in this event.
Wow.
In the same year, yes. In the same year, he took home the American Birding Association's Young Birder of the Year Awards.
Hey.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I appreciate the introduction, but my name is Alec Wyatt. Some of you may have seen my presentation called Bluebirds and Wildfire at the Texas Bluebird Society's Summer Bluebird Symposium, or actually the March event earlier this year. So I'm going to be speaking about a similar topic, but from a little bit of a different angle. Tonight's presentation is called Humans and Wildfire. And this time I'm going to be looking at it from a little bit of a broader perspective, rather than narrowing to the perspective of how does it affect bluebirds. I'd like to look at how wildfire affects people and our property, and also ask the question of how that relates to our environment, and try and see if we can coexist with wildfire in a way that is beneficial to the environment while not being destructive to our property. But before I begin, I just want to thank all of you for allowing me to be here this evening. I'm very, very excited to be here with this group. I have immense respect for the Texas Master Naturalists organization. I've wanted to be one for a while. Unfortunately, I'm still a little bit too young. I'm currently 17 years old. However, one day I would love to be a part of this. I'm currently...
We would make special certificates.
Thank you so much. I would love to. I admire so much of what happens here. Well, I'm currently about to be a senior in high school. I go to school in San Antonio, and I have a diverse set of interests that brought me here this evening, including birds, nature, science, conservation, and wildfire, all of which I've been pursuing to some extent for the past several years, and which have led me to some pretty specific interests that I've had a lot of fun pursuing, whether in the community or doing some research on my own. And that has really been what has propelled my interest in a lot of my free time over the past several years. I have also had the good fortune of living in multiple places throughout my lifetime. Most recently, I'm going on about 2 years here in Texas. Prior to that, I spent 6 years in Colorado, and those were some of my more formative years, I think. That was where I discovered a passion for nature and for birds, as well as a keen interest in wildfire ecology. I was also the 2014 ABA Young Birder of the Year during my time in Colorado. And I was also the 2015 Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education Outstanding Youth Environmental Leader. I have a bad habit of climbing in high places such as cliffs and trees in search of birds, and I don't really go very many places without my binoculars. I cannot really tell you what I was pursuing at these times, but it's taken me some pretty interesting places. Just this past week, I was going on some college visits. I haven't quite decided where I'm going to go to college after this next year, but I like to think that that trip was half a college visit trip and half a birding trip. I developed a love for nature and birds while I was attending a school called School in the Woods. This was a tiny school in the town of Black Forest, Colorado, outside of Colorado Springs. It only had room at the time for 52 fourth graders. It was a public school, but it was a natural science-focused public school. And so those 52 lucky fourth graders who were able to attend School in the Woods had the opportunity to learn science by going outside. We hiked to the pond and studied pond organisms instead of reading science out of a textbook. We learned math on blackboards outdoors. We ate lunch outdoors. For recess, our playground was just the forest, and our only boundary was we could go as far as we wanted as long as we could see the school and knew how to get back. So This is an Alec Wyatt from a former day. This is my first day of school in 2008. I've grown a foot and some inches since then, but I'm no less a part of School in the Woods. This is me in 2013. At that point, I was still even a little shorter than I am now, unfortunately. But I have many times I've gone back to School in the Woods to, in this case, in my 8th grade year, to teach the students about ornithology, how to study birds, how to study nest boxes, and anything that related to their study of birds in their sort of cumulative research project that happened in spring called the Springfield Projects. And so I have now spent over 24 cumulative hours working directly with students at School in the Woods, teaching them about birds for their Springfield projects. Additionally, I initiated and led a series of youth bird walks for local kids and also their parents in the Colorado Springs area, where I provided them with notebooks and pencils and access to binoculars and field guides, and we went out to the best local places to go see if we can learn about birds. And my intent there was to try and get kids outside who might not normally have an interest in being outside. Many of the School in the Woods kids that I worked with were already intently interested in birds or natural science or insects or whatever their specialty might have been at that point. Here, my intent was to get kids outside who hadn't been before. Here are a few selections from my field notebook in 2013. This I submitted to the American Birding Association's Young Birder of the Year contest. These are a few selections out of a notebook that ended up being 45 pages long, and I submitted those to a panel of judges as a part of my 6-month-long submission for that contest that ended up being bound in a little book that was over 150 pages long. So I can assure you I was awfully busy during that time of my life, but I had a blast. These are, yes. Yeah, these are copies straight out of that notebook from my own drawings and notes. So I also spent 2 years during my time in Black Forest monitoring a nest box trail, both in 2012, which was the year before the Black Forest fire, which I'll talk quite a bit more about. Also in 2013, the year of the fire, and clearly this isn't showing up all that well on the screen, but this is a tree swallow on top of one of my nest boxes with a completely charred and blackened forest in the background. And so that was a mixed experience. There were a lot of negative parts about that experience. It was an extraordinarily destructive fire. I'll talk more about that. However, it afforded me an extremely important opportunity, I think, to see the interface between fire and the natural environment, as well as the human interface with nature. So with a little bit about me out of the way, I just want to mention sort of an overview of what I'll be covering this evening, including the Black Forest fire in my hometown in Colorado in 2013, as well as the Bastrop County Complex fire in 2011, not too far from here, and also the Hidden Pines fire in 2015. Additionally, I want to take a look at humans and our property as they relate to the greater environment, and trying to see if there's a way we can coexist with fire such that we can benefit the environment by preserving the natural fire cycle while also preserving ourselves and our property. Also, I'd like to take a look at a management strategy, because I'm going to be covering a whole lot of problems that we have before us right now, and I'd like to think there are some solutions, and fortunately there are. And so I'll be covering a national strategy for wildfire management. So I'm going to start in Black Forest on the 11th of June in 2013. So Colorado, much of the state of Colorado was under a pretty severe drought during that time. This fire it took place in El Paso County, Colorado. And so that one is right about here. And so you can see much of the county at that point was under the influence of extreme to exceptional drought. And so that played a heavy influence in the fires that took place that summer, both that summer and the summer before. On that afternoon, a spark was set by human hands. To this day, we're not exactly sure how, but we know that it was a human-caused fire. And this was a fire that quickly got out of control and began destroying dozens of homes. It burned for about a week before it was fully contained. It ended up burning over nearly 6,000 hectares of land and ended up destroying 486 homes. It also caused 2 deaths in the Black Forest area. And so nothing about this fire really was a natural wildfire. This particular forest is almost a purely ponderosa pine ecosystem. And so the ponderosa pine forest is a fire-dependent ecosystem. Naturally, every 10 years or so, fire will go through the ponderosa forest. It'll clean out some of the understory and the bottom layer on the forest floor and prevent overcrowding and diversify the forest. It does a lot of positive things. But unfortunately, humans have really prevented that natural cycle from taking place. Black Forest was subject to fire suppression for a really, really long time. And we prevented that cycle of natural fire from taking place. And so there was extensive fuel loading throughout much of Black Forest, both on the public lands and the privately owned lands. Landowners didn't really manage their properties properly, and so there was an excessive amount of fuel on the property that when a spark was set, paired with the drought, it became a disastrous fire. So this was really, in most cases, and most places in Black Forest, a very unnatural fire. So this is a particularly important area of Black Forest to me, as it appeared in 2011 before the fire. This is section 16, which was 1 square mile of land where School in the Woods was, and also where my nest box trail of 36 nest boxes stood. Right over here to the left is where my house was, so that just goes to show how close to home this was for me. This is how that area of Black Forest appeared on June 12th, 2013, the day after the fire started. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here to the northeast quadrant of section 16, again as it appeared in 2011. This is where my nest boxes were. The primary objective for the nest box trail, the sort of main area of study, were western bluebirds. It wasn't exclusively for western bluebirds, but that was the intent. And so they were placed, clearly you can see, in a lot of forest edge habitat and a lot of open field habitat with scattered brush and open areas for the bluebirds to forage. And there was also, there's a pond up here in the northern part of the property that during the summer of 2013 was so dry that there really wasn't a pond anymore, it was just a hole. Down here at the bottom, in another little red blur, is School in the Woods. So it's all very close together in this section of the property. And now you can see how it looked on June 12th, again the day after the fire. At this point, actually, section 16 is still burning. On June 12th, the southeastern part of the property was actually still actively burning. You can see here, I wanted to highlight a couple areas of particularly high severity fire. You saw in some of the pictures that I showed earlier where not only the understory, but also the canopy of the trees were completely incinerated. And so that's extremely high intensity, high severity fire that really wipes out the forest. And that's not typically what happened in a natural cycle of fire in a ponderosa pine forest. That was very much more severe than what would normally happen with frequent natural fire. So what you might notice is that on section 16, there wasn't a lot of that extremely intense crown fire. It was only in a few isolated places. However, north of that road up at the top of the screen, it was a different story. That's private land. There were a lot of houses up there, and so that land was not managed quite as well. Section 16 was owned by the county of El Paso, and so they worked to manage that land to mitigate the wildfire risk. However, the properties to the north suffered much more severe fire damage because of the lack of management. So this is, this is School in the Woods as it appeared actually after the fire. So you can see it's still there. You might also notice some stumps down in front of the school. Those were trees that were cut down by firefighters during the fire in an effort to prevent the school from burning. Firefighters from all around the state of Colorado and even outside the fire worked to protect School in the Woods. They dug a fire line all the way around the entire school. It's hard to tell from here because none of the trees are burned and none of the ground is burned and the school is perfectly fine. But there was actually a ring around the entire school. Outside of that ring, the ground was completely scorched. Everything outside of there burned. Many of the trees burned. But inside of that ring, everything was completely protected. And it took the work of firefighters across the state to produce that fire line and to protect the school. The school, of course, survived and is still open today. But that took the management that went into Section 16 to allow that to happen. There was defensible space around the school, which is allowing the firefighters to do their jobs and to protect the structure. And so that is something I'm going to come back to a little bit, why Section 16 was different, because most of Black Forest is not at all a success story. We lost people, we lost property, and we lost the integrity of the environment in most of Black Forest. So now I want to take a look at the environmental factors of that particular wildfire, mostly the bluebirds on Section 16, because that was my area of study. That was what I was paying the most attention to, both before, during, and after the fire. While the fire was taking place, I really expected the nest boxes to be either lost entirely in the fire or at least to be abandoned, because not only was I aware that Section 16 was burning, but even when it wasn't actively burning, there was a thick plume of smoke that was covering the entire forest, and I fully expected the adult bluebirds who were tending those nests and the adults of all the other species not to stay and tend those nests. At that time, there were 63 eggs total in all of those nest boxes. There were no nestlings yet, because that was just about the time of the season there when all of those eggs were about to hatch. And so it was a very, very unfortunate time for that to take place. So I'd like to take a look a little bit now at both the before and the after of the nest box draft. So a little bit of data on the western bluebirds. On June 3rd, that was the last day I monitored all the nest boxes prior to the fire. I intended to go out and take a look again on June 11th, which was the day of the fire, but it was so hot that day that I decided I was going to wait until later in the afternoon when it cooled off to go take a look at those nest boxes. June 11th ended up being the hottest day of an exceptionally dry year, and that was together with high winds to produce the Black Forest fire. It wasn't until June 27th when the mandatory evacuation order was lifted on Section 16, and I was allowed to go back onto the property and take a look at what happened. So, as you can tell by these numbers, the nest boxes actually survived. They, of those 36 nest boxes that were out there, all 36 survived the fire. The one that you saw in the picture before, box number 18, that sustained some pretty severe fire damage, was actually the only one that sustained severe fire damage, and was one of the few boxes on the trail that was not occupied at that time by any species. And so it really was an exceptionally surprising outcome. You can see that there were 17 bluebird nests in those nest boxes, and 16 when I came back, and the reason for that is because there was a violet green swallow that decided to take over a former bluebird nest, so that's why that number went down by 1. There were 59 bluebird eggs in those nest boxes, which were reduced to 31 by the time I got back, because many of those eggs hatched. And as I said, there were 0 nestlings. The last time I saw the nest box trail, that turned into 35 bluebirds alive and growing up in those nest boxes when I returned. There were 47 total nestlings of all species growing up in those nest boxes. So between 2012, the pre-fire year, and 2013, there are some really interesting numbers. There were more nests for bluebirds in 2013. There were fewer, considerably fewer, eggs per nest, so the clutch sizes were smaller that year. However, there were still more eggs total, a slightly higher number of bluebirds fledged per nest on average, and a considerably higher number of bluebirds fledged total, 34 in 2012 versus 45 in 2013. And so that was a really remarkable number for me to take a look at, that in this year where there was no extremely severe disturbance, there were fewer bluebirds that fledged than in 2013. And so what that goes to show is there's really no way to say that it was entirely good or entirely bad, because at that time the Section 16 was a little bit different than the rest of the forest, clearly. The management on the property allowed this sort of semi-positive outcome to take place. And so what I'm getting at is that even though this is a small sample size, it seems to indicate that wildfire on managed land does not have to be catastrophic. And it can actually be beneficial for the environment while still preserving human life and property, because not only were the nest boxes preserved, the school in the woods was preserved as well. So following the fire, much of Black Forest looked a little bit like this on June 20th, a few days afterward. The ground is scorched, the trees are scorched up to the canopy. It also looked a little bit like this around the nest box trail, where the ground underneath every single nest box was burned, but the nest boxes were still standing. However, it wasn't too long before on section 16 it started to look like this on July 30th, where kinnikinick, otherwise known as bearberry, is starting to grow back. A lot of the ground cover and the grasses are starting to grow back. And also like this on August 30th, where we have the woolly mullein and the asters and the toadflax and the grasses growing back, and a lot of the trees are still surviving at that time. So all the nest boxes are still standing, still productive, and a lot of that lower layer of the forest is already growing back from the ashes. That really, it happened a little bit faster because we had some rain at that point. But the forest was really recovering exceptionally quickly. Now, I was very excited to see what happened in 2014, but unfortunately I didn't really get to entirely because of my move to Texas. So what happened after the fire in 2013 was I got together with some local kids in Black Forest, and we built 14 new nest boxes. And so we had a total of 50 on the property out there going into the 2014 season. And because I had to move about halfway through the season, I didn't entirely get to see what happened, but I got a pretty good glimpse of it on June 18th, which is pretty close to mid-season, when most of the eggs that are going to be laid were there, and most of the nests that were going to be there were there. And at that time, there were 23 bluebird nests, 5.2 eggs per nest, which is a pretty considerable increase in clutch size, and 68 nestlings total. And so what I did is, since I had a pretty good glimpse of about how many eggs total there were going to be that season, I adjusted those values to account for the size increase in the nest box trail. So considering that extra increase in the number of boxes, of course the number of nests and total eggs was going to go up. So I adjusted that value down to account for the size in the nest box trail. And even with that adjustment, we still had an increase of 3.5% in the total number of nests, an increase in 12.8% in clutch size, and this really is the striking number to me, an increase in 23.9% in the total number of nestlings. Again, that is already accounting for the change in the size of the nest box trail. So 2014, even though I missed part of it, and I'm so disappointed about that, it was an incredible year. Following the fire, once we got some rain, all of the nutrients in the ground were making it an exceptional environment for plant growth. The ecosystem really, really thrived on section 16. Now, again, I just want to point out, all of Black Forest was not that way, and in many ways it was otherwise catastrophic. But section 16, because it was a managed property, we had some positive outcomes. Now I'd like to take a look at Bastrop in 2011 on September 4th in the Bastrop County Complex fire. So Texas was in the midst of a record-breaking drought at that time. Almost the entire state of Texas was considered to be in a state of exceptional drought, and certainly all of Bastrop County. On the afternoon of September 4th, there were 2 fires that started in 2 separate locations, probably because heavy winds blew over trees, which fell on power lines, which showered some sparks on the ground and ignited the dry fuels on the ground. Later there was a 3rd fire that started, and so that's why it was a complex fire, and the 3 fires eventually merged. It took until October 10th before the fire was contained. Much of Bastrop State Park burned, or very much most of Bastrop State Park burned. And a large part of the Lost Pines Forest, that disjunct area of loblolly pines from East Texas piney woods, was also destroyed. And it also caused 2 deaths, much like the Black Forest fire. So in the end, 13,406 hectares burned in total, and 1,673 homes were destroyed, making it the most destructive wildfire in the history of the state of Texas. That sounds awfully similar to the Black Forest fire, which was also the most destructive wildfire in the history of the state of Colorado. So I want to take a look at another little patch of land here from the satellite imagery. This is the Griffith League Scout Ranch outside of Bastrop before the fire. This was a study area for breeding birds, as well as habitat for the endangered Houston toad and a number of other species. And this area sustained severe fire damage. This is what it looked like on September 7th following the fire. Now, this is another sort of interesting case that I'd like to point out, because in my studies on bluebirds, I found that there was actually a positive correlation between eastern bluebird nesting and wintering habitat and these burned areas. However, the Houston toad lost a large part of its habitat. There are continuing erosion problems throughout the area, and the dead trees that are beginning to fall that suffered from the Crown Fire are now leaving considerably more fuel on the forest floor for future fires. So now, or not now, but 1 year after the fire, Bastrop State Park is using controlled burns again. So the managed areas are burning less severely in the future because wildfire is to some extent inevitable, but by managing that land again and trying to preserve that natural cycle of fire, trying to keep those controlled burns and that mechanical thinning going, they're reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfire in the future. And so overall, this was an example of a catastrophic wildfire, again, in which people, property, and the environment suffer. Again, it's hard to say that it's entirely good or entirely bad, but it's hard to argue that the human component of this was a tragedy. And much of the environmental component of it was as well. Now, back to Bastrop again, this time in 2015. A lot of the state of Texas is still in a pretty severe drought at this time. Bastrop County is in extreme to exceptional drought at this time. And not all of the state of Texas is, but much of the area is still very, very dry, very, very prone to igniting very severe fires. So now, this fire started from a brush fire on the Leaky farm. An employee attempted to extinguish the fire, but it spread rapidly in the dry conditions. It was up to an hour, actually, after the fire started, before a call was made to produce a response to the fire. And at that time, there were also not enough personnel available to control the fire. Many of the fire crews were elsewhere fighting other fires at the time. And so this was something of a perfect storm. Beyond that, the fire was also about 4 times larger than it was initially estimated to be by firefighters. And so we ended up with another catastrophic fire in Bastrop, only a few years following the first one. This, you can see, is close to where the fire started by the Leaky Farm's name in the trees. In this fire, 64 homes were destroyed and 1,854 hectares were destroyed. All of these unnecessary, because while fire is somewhat inevitable, the destruction of people in our property, as it was in this case, is not necessary. None of those 64 homes needed to be destroyed. None of that land needed to burn in an excessively unnatural, severe fashion. And so solutions, fortunately, in Bastrop are being pursued right now. And so I want to talk about some of those. And so that's a very positive aspect. But this is another instance where we had an unnecessarily destructive fire that could have been prevented. This is the Leaky Farm in 2014 before the fire. And I don't have satellite imagery for what it looks like following the fire. But this is sort of the map of where the fire burned on, as it appeared on October 16th. The green shows where the fire had burned by October 13th. At that point, it was covering 612 hectares. The yellow on 14 October, and it had covered 1,018 hectares. And the red shows 15 October, after having covered 1,854 hectares. Now, fortunately, Bastrop County is, as I said, developing a mitigation project. They're reducing fuels in populated areas, and there's something of a partnership developing between private landowners and the county. All of these are extremely positive developments. This is allowing us to not only properly manage our land between public lands and private lands, but it's allowing us to be more prepared to respond to fires when they happen in the future. So briefly, I'd like to take a little bit of a look at a comparison between the 3 fires and some of the human component of those fires. The first Bastrop fire was in 2011, 2013 for Black Forest, and just a few months ago for the Hidden Pines fire. Both of the 2 bookends here were in, or at least based in Bastrop County, the Black Forest fire in El Paso County. The Bastrop County Complex fire covered the largest area at over 13,000 hectares, Black Forest over 5,000, and Hidden Pines short of 2,000. And in Bastrop, the first time 1,673 homes were lost. In Black Forest, nearly 500, and in the Hidden Pines fire, 64. Many of those, again, unnecessary. The Bastrop County Complex Fire caused roughly $325 million in damage, $90 million for Black Forest, and $8 million for the Hidden Pines Fire. Now, as we take a look at the future and what we can do better after seeing all of the problems and all of the shortcomings that happened with these fires, we kind of need to examine where we stand with wildfire. And we need to ask kind of how should we manage it and how should we prepare for it, and whether we should try to prevent it. And also, how do we protect people, their homes, but also wildlife and their habitat. I think there's a way that we can do all of those things. And so the way forward, I think, is the national strategy. This is the final part of my presentation, covering this sort of way forward after we've seen what has happened. I like to think there are solutions if we're willing to pursue them. The national strategy, I think, is required to address what has happened here. Unfortunately, the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture have us covered. They've provided a lengthy report on what we can do, looking at the nation as a whole, but also breaking it up into smaller parts, and taking a look at how we can manage those areas on an individual basis as we prepare for wildfire in the future. We have two, I think, overarching problems that are facing us right now. First of all, climate. In the western United States, we're facing, or really at large, but specifically in the western United States, here we're facing large temperatures and a prolonged drought. That's producing conditions that are extremely conducive to severe wildfires. We're also facing a management problem. Now, this one is a little bit easier for us to solve than the climate problem. In much of the western United States and elsewhere, we're seeing pretty much overt fire suppression in an attempt to prevent fire from happening at all, in an attempt to preserve our property, which is important but somewhat of a failed approach, because between that and inadequate management of our land, we end up producing bigger problems later on. And so with the warmer temperatures and the prolonged drought, we end up with more frequent fires, and fires that happen with greater severity. However, with the management problem, it's a little bit different. When we suppress fire, they happen with less frequency. However, when they do happen, they happen with greater severity. And so in any case, with these two facets of what we have before us, we end up with more severe wildfires that are more destructive to the environment and more destructive to our own property. So the national strategy provides us with something of a vision going forward, and I think that's really, really important to consider. One of those being that we should be able to safely and effectively extinguish fire when needed. When it threatens our property, we should be able to contain fires, and that's going to require resources and a coordinated approach. We want to be able to use fire where allowable, and I think this is one of the most important things we need to acknowledge going forward, is that many of these environments that we live in are dependent upon having somewhat of a natural cycle of relatively low severity fire. And this one, I think, is the big one. We should be able to live with wildland fire. We're already coexisting with our natural environment. We should be able to coexist with fire too, and I think that that's something that we can do if we take some steps toward that. The bottom line is that fire is crucial in a lot of environments, especially here in the western United States, certainly in the ponderosa pine forest of Black Forest, certainly here in the Lost Pines region. These are ecosystems that are dependent on periodic fire, and I think it's up to us to work to preserve that cycle. So natural wildfire tends to be a very, very good thing. It diversifies the canopy cover, prevents it from being too homogeneous of a forest. It increases species richness, providing habitat for many more species than would otherwise make use of the environment. It promotes natural succession following a fire for early successional species to replace those that were destroyed. And it provides feeding and breeding habitat for a great number of species that depend on those burned areas, like pine beetles and black-backed woodpeckers, for example. Fire suppression, on the other hand, degrades the quality of the habitat for a lot of species, and it hinders that natural succession process, and it increases the destructiveness of fires when they do happen. And so fire suppression ultimately does not do us any favors. So the national strategy has divided the nation into 3 regions, and we can approach each of these differently, but there are also some similarities between those, allowing us to move forward with sort of a cohesive plan. It divides it into the northeast, southeast, and the western region, and each region has diverse interfaces between humans and wildlands. And many of those who are at risk are the ones who are living in the wildland-urban interface, where our own structures interact with the natural environment. And so, first off, the northeast region, the majority of the land is privately owned. The fire there, because it's so crowded in that region, presents a high risk to life and property. And while there's a low occurrence of large wildfires, when they do happen, they tend to be very destructive. In the southeast, nearly 90% of the land is privately owned, and so that presents a challenge for coordinating efforts between governments and landowners. There are many fire-dependent ecosystems down there, just like out west, and there's an expansive wildland-urban interface, and also high fuel loading out there due to extensive fire suppression. Now, the western region is perhaps the stickiest problem. We have a majority of our land publicly owned. We're facing an extended drought right now of several decades and a century of fire suppression, as well as perfect conditions for large, severe, extremely costly wildfires. Vast expanses of the West have less than 1 fire station per square mile, which gives us quite a resources problem, as we've seen in several times in the past, especially with the Hidden Pines fire. And also, much of the West faces steep slopes, beetle-killed trees, and poor access to these environments, and the list goes on and on and on, making it a difficult problem to solve out in the West, but it's one that we can take steps toward alleviating. So I like to think there have to be some solutions here. And there have been some successes in the past in trying to implement these solutions. One of those successes is the partnership between the county and private owners in Bastrop County. They're implementing not only the controlled burns, but mechanical clearing, which mimics that natural cycle of fire. And these are all extremely important things to preserve the ecosystem and also prepare ourselves for what will happen in the future. Another success I'd like to take a look at is Section 16, but I'll come back to that in depth a little bit later. As far as solutions that have been implemented already and that need to happen more on a national scale, are a bit of a change of public opinion. We need, well, right now the public generally disapproves of controlled burns, and this needs to change because it's so important. It's crucial to fuel reduction and the preservation of that natural wildfire cycle. Landowners also need to know how to manage their own properties and to respond to wildfire when it happens. We also need a team effort between communities and their government, as we've seen already happening in Bastrop. And we need to understand the risks and environmental characteristics of our land on a local scale. There are also a couple specific programs that can be implemented and have been implemented already in communities that have done a great deal of help. One of those is Firewise communities. Firewise communities educate residents on property management and also fire mitigation on their own property, and it gives homeowners some defensible space around their structures, like there was a school in the woods. It teaches them about fire-resistant materials for their home and also sound landscaping, and it produces resilient properties. Firewise communities are already happening in Black Forest and elsewhere, and these are really positive developments to educate residents on how to manage their own property. Additionally, there's the Ready, Set, Go program, which fosters a cooperation between fire departments and residents of communities, and it facilitates evacuations in the event of fire, so that when fire is approaching a community, residents are able to react to that in a way that ensures their safety more than would otherwise be available with just reverse 911 calls and less coordinated approaches. And so with these solutions that we have before us, there have been some successes. I'd like to highlight Section 16 now, not all of Black Forest, specifically Section 16. Section 16 was managed with controlled burns and mechanical thinning. There was a defensible space around School in the Woods. There was a reduced fuel load on the property. The natural cycle of fire was simulated on much of that property. And because of that, the destruction of property, such as School in the Woods, the nest boxes, and the environment was minimized. It actually seemed to improve the quality of the habitat. Now, my own little study on the nest boxes is not enough to really make that assertion. It was an awfully small sample size in a short amount of time. But just from what I got an impression of from my own experience out there, it seemed to be thriving in that next year, not only the nest boxes, but the entire community. And I think that's because when the fire did reach Section 16, it burned in a natural way. That little square mile of land appeared so different from the rest of Black Forest in the satellite imagery afterward, because it was not completely incinerated by a severe fire. Now, I think all of this can have something of a happy ending. I think we can learn to live with wildland fire, as the national strategy says that is possible. Loss of life and property can be minimized while still protecting species and their habitat. And it starts with an awareness of existing problems before us, and also a willingness to pursue solutions until we achieve that success. And it starts with awareness. And so with that, I want to say thank you very much for allowing me your time to speak with you here today. And I appreciate it greatly. Thank you very much.